The release of the U-Phase Legacy DLC to AoE 4 has included a new civ called the Jin Dynasty. The pro players that had pre-release access to the civilization called it gorgeous looking with a very strong eco and military units that were pretty special. Having played them myself now, the Jin Dynasty is a bit like eating at a restaurant you can't really afford. Everything looks great, the food is great, but in the end, everything's too expensive. If it was a Family Guy episode, their archers would be meg. Mid-edit update, the archers and a bunch of other units just got buffed, so no idea how good they are now. Now it is still early days, so maybe we just haven't figured out how to use them properly yet. I certainly haven't played enough games with them to really know them, but in order to improve my understanding of this, I felt like looking at one unit to really figure out how it works and make a video about it to take you all along with me on that journey. I've picked the Iron Pagoda to focus on in this video. I think it's the one unit that is the most likely to not get significantly changed with any buffs in the future, so any matchups we can look at for this video will probably stay the same. No changes for the Iron Pagoda in the hotfix. Everything stayed the same. If that's not the case, I'm gonna pin those changes in the first comment under this video. The Iron Pagoda is the Jin Dynasty's replacement for the Knight. It's available from the Feudal Age onwards, so the best point of comparison of course is the Feudal Age Knight. For example, from the Rus civilization, a lot of these stats are quite similar. They have the same ranged armor, movement speed and attack speed. Their health is higher than that of the regular knight by 10, and they also have 1 extra melee armor. However, their damage is lower by 3 and they also have a lower charge damage. So all in all, they have less damage but are tankier than their regular equivalents. They do cost 25 more gold, which is about a 10% increase in price, which is quite significant. They also have the passive ability to deal splash damage with every auto attack. Now, judging the exact strength of this splash damage is quite tricky, I think, in a regular game. So we're gonna zoom in on this effect right now. First up, we just have a knight charging into some villagers here. The villagers are on hold position, so they don't do anything, but you can see there is no splash damage at first glance. These villagers are standing in a regular formation, and that regular formation distance between them is already enough to negate all splash damage. That means if you're chasing some units and they are walking in formation, for example some archers, you would probably not be getting any splash damage from that. However, when units are fighting you, they tend to bunch up more. Here we see some villagers that are now trying to kill this Iron Pagoda, and as you can see, there's clearly a lot of splash damage going on. The exact numbers on the splash damage can be seen if we slow down a bit. One auto attack deals 20 damage here, and that auto attack also deals 4 damage to the villager next to it. The exact amount of the splash damage, however, varies depending on the positioning and the distance between the targets. It can go as high as 50%, although that's very rare and only if the second target is in a very specific position. On average, I would say it's about 20%, so for Feudal Age, 4 damage to the targets next to the primary target. The damage, however, does scale with the damage of the auto attacks from the Iron Pagoda. So in the Imperial Age, they deal a lot more splash damage than they do in the Feudal Age. I also did some experimentation regarding armor and splash damage, and from my somewhat uncertain testing, it appears that the splash damage seems to simply cut through the armor and is not affected by melee armor whatsoever. So, I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt. It's hard to measure that exactly, but I think it ignores armor, which would make the Iron Pagoda better against higher armored units. Now, in order to analyze the performance of the Iron Pagoda compared to other knights, I'm gonna look at some specific categories, and that is the things that I think are most important for knights. 1, we have fighting other knights. 2 is killing military units that are outnumbered and alone on the map by themselves. And 3 is killing enemy villagers. Alright, first up we've got a 1v1 up top and a larger number at the bottom. These are all Feudal Age units and just Rus Knights without any specific upgrades, so just one of the Feudal Age Knights. I think the 1v1 here is actually kind of important. Knights often are out and about alone and fighting in low numbers, so the mass battle isn't just necessarily more important. Also keep in mind, the Iron Pagodas are more expensive than the regular knights. In the end, we see here that as far as the knight versus knight battle are concerned, the Rus Knights win both cases, despite having a resource advantage. At least in the Feudal Age. We'll repeat it in Castle later, but the general trend holds there. Just for some variety, I also put them up against the Keshiks as well as the Chevaliers. Both cases equal resources. The 1v1s are always won by the Pagoda here because they are just way more expensive than these units. However, in the equal resource matchups, the Keshiks and the Chevaliers win quite confidently, and that is kind of despite neither of these units being considered to be very good against other knights. So yeah, knight versus knight battle does not look good for the Iron Pagoda. Alright, the next category is picking up lone units off of the map. I've put both the Iron Pagoda and the Rus Knight here up against a singular spear. Spears are quite common as a counter to knights. It's what your opponent will want to build when you are going for heavy cavalry. In order to get him advantage as the knight player, you're gonna want to be mobile, active on the map, find single spears and kill them before they can like outmass you and then snowball that advantage into a win. As you can see here, the Iron Pagoda did take slightly more damage and it took him longer to get the kill on that singular spear. So as you would expect, the regular knight does better here in these small number fights. However, if we look at a 12 versus 12 here with larger numbers, the Iron Pagoda actually kinda improves their performance. The splash damage becomes relevant. However, this scenario with the 12 versus 12 seems much less likely than the single spear getting picked up off the map, in my opinion. Realistically, at these numbers, you want to have some archers or something that prevents the knights from taking full-on fights with spears. There is, however, something to be said here, I think, about having to rethink the Iron Pagodas, not to use them the way we use knights traditionally and more for large fights, where they fight large numbers of infantry units and therefore make use of their splash damage, even if that puts them in danger of being countered by spears. We can also see this going up against these ranged units. First up, let's make a comparison against archers. Ranged units in particular could be microed in a way where the splash damage can be minimized simply by pulling them backwards a little bit and even using the scatter formation for a button just to, increase their effectiveness against the Iron Pagoda. I did not do this here to highlight the difference between the two units and just, I don't know, in a general game things can be messy. However, the Iron Pagoda did not shine here as much as I would have expected them to. It's a little bit down to luck here that one of the Iron Pagodas got focused down pretty hard, but in the end, actually, the archers do quite well. Even, to be fair, they have a massive resource advantage, but they're not being microed at all here, and they end up winning against the Iron Pagoda, however losing against the Rus Knights, so just because it's infantry doesn't automatically mean that the Iron Pagoda have a huge advantage. Maybe this would change if we increased the numbers on both sides again, but at some point I feel like I'm looking for scenarios to make the unit good rather than being convinced by its own merits. You can also look at the crossbows here, where actually somehow counterintuitively the Iron Pagoda do better than I had expected. I think this is due to their large HP pool. Both the knights and the Iron Pagodas take bonus damage from the crossbows, however, the Iron Pagodas can tank these shots better because they just have more HP. Also, this is all happening now in the Castle Age, and something that I only hinted at before is that the Iron Pagoda, when they go from Feudal Age to Castle Age, the veteran version of them just gets a huge stat boost that's bigger than that of the Knight when they go into the Castle Age. So they probably do better in Castle overall. That's also when the number of units increases, so the splash damage becomes more relevant in the later stages of the game. We can also see this against these man-at-arms. Heavy cavalry is considered to be a soft counter to man-at-arms, and we can actually see this happening here. Both of these knights do very well. However, the Iron Pagoda actually does a little bit better because the man-at-arms do clump up in front of them quite nicely when the splash damage is applied, and as we know, the splash damage cuts through armor, so these men-at-arms are actually taking disproportionate amount of damage from the splash damage because their melee armor is being ignored. As a result, the Iron Pagoda actually cleaned this up quite fast and with more HP left over. So, for a little bit of a surcharge, you get a better unit against man-at-arms. Alright, lastly, we're gonna look at killing villagers. I think this is actually quite key for knights, especially early on. The standard scenario is that an early knight arrives and tries to kill a villager on gold, as we've seen just now. In practice, the Rus Knights here needs to get in the charge and that hit 2 more auto attacks. This is pretty standard. The only one that does better than this in Feudal Age is the French Knight, because they get a damage boost after their charge, which actually is enough to finish off the villager with their second attack, so that a third attack is not needed. The Iron Pagoda also falls into the category of the Rus Knight and needs 3 auto attacks, although the villager still has more HP after the second auto attack. So they're slightly worse at this, but not in a measurable way, I think. Both the Rus Knights and the Iron Pagoda, however, do 2-hit villagers when they had their veteran version of themselves. So it kind of balances out in the Castle Age. The only knight that can't 2-hit villagers in Castle, I think, is the Kashik. So again, Iron Pagoda gets a lot better when they do hit Castle Age. The splash damage, however, is never really an advantage, I think, when it comes to killing these villagers, as long as they're just on a wood line or whatever. They take some extra splash damage, but the Iron Pagodas kind of need to be left alone for a long time for the splash damage to really become relevant. As soon as the villagers start running away, the splash damage isn't that relevant anymore, so I don't know. There are some special scenarios, however, where I think the splash damage can become very relevant. For example, when a building is destroyed, a lot of villagers may pop out of it that were hiding inside of it. Those villagers will be very stacked up on top of each other. Usually those villagers are in trouble anyway and are gonna die as always, but they take especially much damage from the Iron Pagodas because of their splash. The other scenario is villagers that are trying to defend oftentimes are used to burn down rams, and when you do that, they tend to clump up very heavily. And this kind of desperation scenarios are really potentially devastating for those villagers when the Iron Pagodas get in there and can get off several auto attacks after another, because the splash damage then does very much stack up and kill the villagers faster than other knights would. Although that's a somewhat specific scenario, and it's not like other knights wouldn't be killing those villagers. But yeah, I think they do better than other knights, for sure. It doesn't seem quite as relevant as when you do it, for example, with a Landsknecht, but still something to keep in mind, I think. Towards the end of my videos, I usually include some sort of statistic that shows how many pro players are using a unit and how many are not. For now, it's still early days of the expansion, so I don't really have those numbers. Also, I don't really know how to get them in an accurate manner. So all I can give you is the vibe I've gotten from watching pro replays, and from what I've seen, most high-level players that play Jin Dynasty don't seem to go for the Iron Pagoda. Their frontline is usually made up of spears and horsemen. The spears specifically, I think, because of their upgrade that gives them a range attack that's honestly pretty popular, but not many Iron Pagoda lovers out there, so maybe they do need a slight buff. I personally also haven't terribly been in love with them, if I'm being honest, so they're kind of a D+ unit in my book. You can use them, but I don't know, I'm never really overwhelmed with how good they are in any specific scenario. But to summarize the knowledge I've gained from this, the Iron Pagoda is a more expensive, more defensive version of a knight that has splash damage that can be tricky to use. They're not as good in the knight versus knight battles, can be better against trash units, and potentially devastating against villagers, although all knights are kind of devastating against villagers. They get a better stat boost than the irregular knights when it comes to the Castle Age, and a slightly worse stat boost in the Imperial Age. So if you want to use them, you should probably aim for a timing push in the Castle Age. All in all, I think maybe slight reduced of the cost would be appropriate. If they cost the same as a regular knight, I don't think they would be busted, and I think that would be good for the balance of the Jin Dynasty. I think the Jin Dynasty on a whole needs a buff, but this particular unit, slight reduction in cost is probably fine. Anyway, that's my 2 cents, I think. I don't know. Have I overlooked anything? Have you found any cases where the Iron Pagoda is busted that I've overlooked? Please let me know in the comments. For now, I can only thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing to Trashcat Incorporated. We are always looking for interns, still today. And with that, I'm out. See you around. Bye-bye.